Hi guys. Every station needs a platform, sure. But what I need for Nant Gwernol is an autumnal platform. Yes, there's actually enough of a difference to make a video about. And in fact, there's more than meets the eye here, and not just the surface to look at. Whilst we're talking about the surface, I'm torn between two materials to use here. Nant Gwernol has an almost rough tarmac look to the most part, but I still want to lay it as I would ballast, and not just paint on a textured paint, for example, because that would lead to annoying brush marks that I'd have to try and fix later. With that in mind, the first of these two materials is slate. Well, I'll call it slate dust. You'll have seen me use grades slightly larger than this on Corris. The other is a grey tile grout. This is from the local DIY store and it's lovely and smooth. Being an artificial grey, the colour would need a lot of adjusting post laying it, but we'll see. Before we get onto the surface itself, the one thing that really needs to get stuck down is the station building. I'm using an all-purpose epoxy for this because it's resin joining to, well, actually I can't remember what the platform base was made from. Anyway, it's thick enough to get a good bond over slightly uneven surfaces. With that all done and set, my first choice for the platform surface is the slate dust. I'm using a small metal ruler to decant piles over the surface. I then use a large brush to tappity tap the slate down, causing it to both spread evenly and level off a bit. Even though it's basically dust, the slate has little pieces of, well, slate in it. I did start picking these out with some needle tip pliers. I did the little station area and then decided that it was close but just too rough. So, using a genuine G. Williamson Models QR card that I ordered way too many of, I'll scoop it up and save it for another job. So it looks like tile grout is the way to go. Because it's so fine, it made sense to first apply a thickest coat of PVA to glue it to. I applied this in a good bead and then spread it out. It does take some time to make sure the PVA is nicely covering the base around the edging slabs, as these are all different sizes. I then used a tiny sieve to add the tile grout. I seem to collect these little sieves whenever I'm in a kitchen shop, but to be fair, I don't want to be in a position in the future where there's a world shortage of miniature sieves and I just don't have enough to start a production line of kids making tiny cookies. I left this to dry and came back the next day, with a frown on my face. I just didn't like the look of the grout. It seemed fluffy, if that makes sense, so I hoovered it off. And then I had an idea. I liked the look of the slate, but with the evenness of the applied grout, so I combined the two applications and sieved the life out of the slate. This left me with a lovely smooth but still textured finish. There is an issue with sieving, and that's the mess. So prior to gluing this stuff down, I need to clean off any over-sieve from around the platform. I'm using a soft brush and I just keep sweeping the slate back onto the platform. With that done, I can lock it in place. This process is the same as ballasting, in that I've laid the material and then I'll add the IPA, or isopropyl alcohol, after. I'm using a piece of paper behind to keep the spray off the ballast, because I've just cleaned the track and I want to keep it nice. With the IPA nicely soaked into the slate, I can add the ballast bond. You can see how, because of the surface tension has been knocked on the head with the IPA, the ballast bond glue spreads nicely across the platform without disturbing the slate itself. That obviously all now looks sopping wet, so it'll need a day or two to dry off and set. So let's take a look at the fencing, shall we? Yes, we shall, because I need to. This is a laser cut card kit by Scale Model Scenery. This is the garden fencing and also includes parts for gates and things like that. However, I'll be modifying it for the Nant Gwernol fence. It's close though. Being laser cut, it all comes on sheets that need cutting free. A sharp knife will really help you here. As soon as it goes blunt, it tears the parts instead of cutting through them. The parts can then be popped out. Don't underestimate how long this fence actually is, because I did. I need to glue a number of strips together for the main section. Being card or MDF or whatever this stuff is, rocket card glue works really well on it. I'm only actually adding tiny dabs of it to the ends, and they'll set together within minutes. The next step is to begin bringing them into a 3D piece, as it's all flat and 2D at the moment. The pack comes with parts to thicken up the main posts and rails. Yes, I did have to look up the names for different parts of a fence for this. These can again be glued on with rocket card glue. I find too much comes out from the tip of the bottle, so I pour some onto some scrap plastic and use a cocktail stick to add smaller amounts to the piece. You can see here how I'm working my way along adding the posts and then the rails for each section. Looking at the fence at Nant, I did then notice that it doesn't have posts that support the fence, but pieces of rail on the rear. So I went about cutting these level with the picket boards. Yes, another real name. I also cut the tops at an angle to match them at the top. To add the rails, I cut pieces from some scrap track that won't be useful for anything, and then glued them on with some super gel. I didn't use super glue because it may absorb into the fence before I can hold the rail in the correct position to dry. At the moment, the rail length is rough, and you'll see why that doesn't matter in a minute. Unlike the incline side of the platform, where the fence is bolted to the back of the wall through the rail sections, the rails are actually sunk into the slate retaining wall, so guess what I need to do now? I've positioned the fence somewhere near to its final resting place, and will mark out the rails on the walling. Using a Dremel, I now cut holes large enough for each piece of the rail to slot into. This is a delicate procedure, as it's really easy to cut straight through the lovely walling. The heat from the Dremel doesn't help that either, to be fair. I'll now dry fit the fence into place to make sure everything slots in nicely. At this point I then found out how fragile a long snake of fencing is, and it broke into a number of smaller, more manageable pieces. With that all looking good, I can paint it up all nice. I've started with a primer because this material seems quite absorbent, and I'm going to be applying acrylics, which are water-based, so I'm hoping the primer will reduce the amount of paint getting absorbed. I then gave the fence a base coat of earth brown. I thought that this would be an ideal base coat in case I missed areas with the finished painted brown colour on top. The fence needs hitting from all angles to get good cover in between the picket boards. And the final painted fence colour. This needs to be finished to look worn and weathered, so I don't mind missing parts on this coat. The platform is now dry but very, very clean. Too clean. And this is autumn. Have you ever been up to Nant Gwernol in autumn? It's wet, it's muddy, it's leafy, and everything's dark. Okie dokie. This is the enamel black wash. I've mentioned the difference in other videos and why I use different black washes for different jobs, but hopefully you'll see why I use this one here. The black wash really leaves the slate looking wet, which is a great step towards the finish I'm looking for. Leaving that to dry and I'm back on the fence, because that is dry. The rail on the back of the fence were originally painted up white by the looks of it, but now basically completely rust. To attempt at getting something similar, I've started by painting the rail sections with white paint as a base. I then looked at how I would apply rust to this look. I tried a few different ideas and settled on this one. 1. I mix up a little bit of weathering powder with water to create a runny, or my word of the week, loose mix. 2. The paintbrush is then dipped in this mix and then wiped on a little bit of clean paper towel. 3. The remains are then dry brushed onto the rails. Kept going until they look rusty enough. I've also tried to vary the level of rust on different posts. The freshly painted brown picket boards are then dry brushed with a mix of light brown to age them down a little bit. The fence can finally get attached to the platform. I say finally because I've probably spent about a total of 10 hours on this little fence this week. But there we go. The fence is glued into place and looking good. But the surface looks like it's freshly laid, so we'll see to that. The first thing that I noticed in pictures from back in late October was that there was a green slimy algae that was very obvious around the edging slabs. I've tried to replicate this with slimy grime thinned down with enamel thinners. This stuff is really easy to overdo as the colour is really intense from the pot, so I like to dab it back a bit once it's applied. I then looked into getting things looking muddy. I ended up using streaking grime, which is not exactly designed for this purpose, but it works really well. And in the same way as the slimy grime, it's dabbed on with a kitchen towel. This leaves the slate stained with a tint of brown. And that's all dry and I'm really pleased with the finish, so on to the leaves. I've mixed the colours to match the leaves on the line and sprinkled them over the platform. You may not be able to see it here, but I've added more leaves up against the fence and around the station, where I think they'd build up out of the wind. Things like that really add life to the model instead of just a generic scattering of leaves. I also wanted to blend the station into the scene a little bit more, so I added leaves to the roof, with a majority settling in the gutters, because that's what leaves live for. It's hard to describe how relieved I am to have found a way to simulate leaves. The leaf scatter needs to be set down as well, but this time I went with IPA followed by Scenic cement. Ballast bond would have worked well as well, but I feel like the Scenic cement, being a little bit thicker, just works a bit better on the station roof. You can see that it's not spreading like ballast bond, so I'm adding more IPA on to really soak it up. And there we go. You can probably tell that I'm really happy with the progress this week. It all looks a bit grotty and actually quite cold, which is brilliant as the layout's going to be set in late October to early November. Off camera I've been busy as well, and post filming this I've sorted out the lighting for the layout, which is much colder than the ones used on Corris, to really try and get that chilly autumnal vibe. When you're looking at the layout, I want you to feel like you're kind of fed up waiting for a train because your nose is running after a walk up the quarries. Specific, I know, but that's the story I'm going with. I'm actually going to be having a couple of weeks off from the Nant project now, as I've got a new toy to play with. And the awdry diorama challenge that the Talyllyn has just been announced, so I'm going to need to do that. You can see here that number 6 is quite happy pulling a good rake of heritage wagons, and the colours and tones used on the stock, as well as that black wash, really suits the layout's colours, which all adds to the final look. You could say we're on the right tracks. Right, where's Skarloey? Cheers.